Right, so I just wanted to say thank you for you all coming to listen to this presentation, because I know it's a topic that isn't spoken about very much and can become like quite uncomfortable to talk about. But the pelvic floor in general is being spoken about more and more in loads of other sports, and I think powerlifting does need to follow that. So for you guys to be part of DBD leading that conversation, that's great. And yeah, thank you all for coming to listen to me. So first of all, I just wanted to talk about my why, so why I'm so passionate about this topic. So it all started, I'm not sure, but Lucy and Callum might remember, we were at a girls DBD event 2 years ago, and we got onto the topic of how we were seeing more and more incontinence on the competition platform, and we didn't really understand why it was happening so much more often. Now I look back at that, and it's probably because, number one, there was more girls competing, but number two, there's more media in powerlifting, so more of it was being streamed and more of it was being picked up on social media and stuff like that. But then about 2 weeks after that DBD girls event, this post came out, and I've covered the influencer's name, but it was a post of her doing a sumo deadlift, and she was incontinent on the platform, and it got 4.5 million views, and the caption said, normalize something that is normal. And then slightly further down it says, all we can do is embrace it and learn how to clean up after. And I fundamentally don't agree with that. I don't think that all we can do is embrace it. I think there are plenty of other methods that we can be using before we turn to just embracing it as our first option. And then what I thought was even worse was then underneath that post was all of the comments that were absolutely horrendous, going through things like, you're disgusting, you need to wear a nappy in the gym, what's wrong with you? So not only are 4.5 million, so let's say half of that, girls seeing that post and reading that they can't do anything about it and we should be embracing it, but they're also seeing these horrible comments but they can't do anything about it. So I think it's just a perfect example of people, especially like the normalizing bit of barriers that to these girls seeking help. So I've got here, like, not the normalization of symptoms will possibly prevent someone from going to a doctor because they don't think that anything's wrong with them, or anything's going wrong with their systems. Lack of understanding, again, they don't understand that anything's going on. Lack of understanding. People feeling uncomfortable to talk about it. So again, it's great that we're having this conversation. There's a taboo or stigma around it. It can be easy to hide. So this is an interesting one because obviously we're all like, oh, you can't hide it, like you'd see it on competition day. But this is, like, especially incontinence, is something that's really easy for girls to hide, or guys. You just put on a pad, and often you won't be like incontinent enough to see any leakage. And then also people make the excuse that makes it really easy to hide, especially if we think about women who have just come back from giving birth. If they're having pelvic floor issues, they've got plenty of other reasons why they might not be able to go to the gym, when really incontinence might be the reason they're not returning. So things like childcare, they're too busy. But yeah, it might actually be their pelvic floor that is having the main effect. And then they've never been asked. If people aren't asked these questions about their pelvic floor or their pelvic health, there's no reason for them to question if there's anything wrong. So questions need to be asked, especially to girls who are symptomatic. So I know that I've gone on quite a lot there about like how many girls it does affect, and it is actually quite a lot. So we've got, in like athletes in general, we've got 25 to 30% of athletes who haven't been pregnant before who are experiencing urinary incontinence, and then 14 to 18% of athletes, again in general, were experiencing pelvic organ prolapse, and I'll go through in a second what that actually is. But those statistics are actually quite low in comparison to powerlifting and strength sports. So this here is a study that was done in America. That was a survey, and they surveyed CrossFitters, powerlifters, and then strong men and strong women. And they found that the prevalence of urinary incontinence in strength training sports was 59.1%. So when looking at the figures from British powerlifting, and don't get me wrong, I know that's not the only federation, but when they've got around 1,500 women, who have got a membership, we're potentially looking at around 900 girls who are experiencing urinary incontinence, who I would love to help. But then they only found that 9.4% of these athletes were seeking any treatment for this urinary incontinence, and 67.9% thought it was just part and parcel of their sport. Again, I'll go through all of the reasons just in a second as to why this isn't actually the case. So again, I've gone through a lot about urinary incontinence. That is not the only type of pelvic floor, and I put dysfunction in question marks, not question marks, in quotation marks, because I think that it's very difficult to start saying that people are dysfunctional, but it's just a word that we use as a medical term as something isn't functioning as it was designed to do. But pelvic flooring dysfunction includes anything where the pelvic floor muscles are too weak, too tight, or poorly coordinated, and that can lead to urinary incontinence, pelvic organ prolapse, which is basically just where either the bladder wall or the rectal wall or the uterus, if you've got one, just descends lower into the vagina, so or the pelvic cavity, so you can feel a sensation of like bulging or heaviness towards the vagina or towards the pelvic opening. Bowel issues, so constipation or loss of control, and then pelvic pain or discomfort. So that can be within movement, but also within sex or within exercise. So that can then, in turn, affect your powerlifting. So you've obviously got the obvious, which is urinary incontinence when lifting, but you've also got anal incontinence when lifting, a consistent urge to go to the toilet between sets. So you often get like people like going for nervous wheeze, but if this is something that's happening like constantly, they're having to run to and from the toilets just to check that either they haven't leaked. Like, it's just something to look out for in powerlifting you might not necessarily think would be related to their pelvic floor. Again, that heaviness or bulging sensation when lifting, often I've heard a lot before, females, especially when deadlifting, will say something like they feel like they're pushing out a tampon. And that's not something just to dismiss, because that can be a sign of having a prolapse that can be assessed and can be given something to do about it. And then feeling a disconnection from the core, that's a difficult one to suggest that that's purely from a pelvic floor perspective, but it is something, obviously, I'm not sure if it is obvious, but the pelvic floor makes up the bottom of your core. So if you're finding that someone is really struggling to brace and they just can't generate pressure, that might be because they're trying to expand into the midsection, but their pelvic floor isn't able to pull up from the bottom and create the pressure that's needed. So again, something you might not have thought your pelvic floor was affect within powerlifting. So barriers to performance, if someone's always thinking about their pelvic floor when they're lifting, that's going to disrupt their focus. They're potentially not going to be making the right decisions, constantly missing RPEs because they might be undershooting, holding back on weight. Skipping sessions altogether. If someone is having a particularly bad week, let's say, you might find that they're skipping sessions all the time. Especially, I'll go into it a bit further, but around their menstrual cycle, if people are skipping sessions, it might not just be because of cramping, it might be because they feel like they're going to be incontinent as well. And then leave the sport altogether. I think there are, although we don't have the research on it, and I am aware of that, there is, I think the prevalence is actually higher than what we might assume, because the people who we're surveying are just the people who are still in the sport, and God knows the amount of people or females who are leaving the sport due to incontinence because they feel like they can't get help, or just because they feel like it's normal, so what's the point in carrying on? So this leads me on to what can you guys do? And I'm in no way saying that I expect you guys to deal with any of these aspects single-handedly. I'm just looking to give you guys more of an understanding about what you guys could be looking out for and keeping the pelvic floor in the back of your mind when you're talking to your athletes. And there's just things that you can be thinking about. So the first thing, like I said to you guys before, was the lack of understanding. So you guys just improving your understanding and just being on this call is brilliant in the first place. And the lack of understanding in general isn't anyone's fault. I genuinely think it's from how we're taught at school. We have our PE lessons and we're taught about what seems to be every single other muscle in the body. Like you can see here, there's 2 diagrams of what we would usually see in lessons. But they both completely neglect the pelvic floor. Like the pelvic floor is a muscle, and yet it's not being labeled on any single anatomy diagram that anyone sees day to day. So I'm about to show you guys, just as a heads up, what the pelvic floor actually looks like in like a drawing, like an anatomy sense. And it's just to show you guys and give you guys the understanding that the pelvic floor is a muscle, and it's no different to any other muscle in the body. So it's still smooth muscle, it still has bony attachments, it still contracts when we think about contracting it. There's no different. We need to be training it for it to get stronger. So there's no real difference. So I don't think it's anything really to be scared about when we're talking. It's not a completely foreign place of the body. And so, yeah, I just wanted to give you guys that understanding that it's not wildly different. So then the next thing that I think as powerlifting coaches is the most connected to the pelvic floor is bracing. Now, hopefully we all know how to brace here, although I'm aware that for some people it's more recent than others. But we all know how to explain a brace to our lifters, the fact that we're expanding our core to create intra-abdominal pressure, which in turn gives the spine more stiffness and allows us to lift heavier but safely. What's important for us to consider, like I mentioned just before, is the fact that we've got the pelvic floor is the bottom of that core canister. And there are certain things that we can ask if we think people aren't bracing correctly that then relate to our pelvic floor, and things that we need to be considering. So number one thing to consider is pressure management. So I would say when it comes to the pelvic floor, we always say expand outwards into our midsection, expand into all different areas. What some people will do, and what we don't even ask, is they will expand downwards as well, because that's where the pressure will go. And people will feel a sensation of like a bearing down when they're lifting, or especially when they're deadlifting, if they can't control that pressure effectively. Now, that's not something you guys can change yourselves, but it is something that you guys can ask the question about. You can ask someone, okay, what do you feel when you're bracing? Where's the pressure going? And if they say, well, I'm feeling it like pushing down into my pelvis, or it's like going up into their chest, we know that they're not managing that pressure correctly. And there are cues that we can give, like you could ask a pelvic floor physiotherapist to assess if that's correct. There are cues that we can give to make sure that they are managing that pressure correctly, and that they're not putting that pressure down into their pelvic region when we want it to be going into their core walls. Next thing to consider is breathing. This is one that took me off guard when I was on my placement for pelvic health, because when I used to do my brace, it was just, okay, take the biggest breath in that you can and just hold it and hope for the best type thing. But then it was brought to my attention that we're taking the biggest breath in, like all of your muscles are strongest in end range. And that includes the intercostal muscles and your core muscles, not in end range, in mid range. That includes your intercostals and your core muscles. So if we're taking the biggest breath in possible and stretching those muscles to end range, we're not actually in the strongest position for our body to cope with that brace. So we want to be making sure that we're breathing into a point where we feel like we're stable, but we're not stretched. So that's just something that we need to be considering, because it's the same thing with the pelvic floor. Your diaphragm and your pelvic floor sort of go up and down at the same time. So as you breathe in, your diaphragm flattens, so does your pelvic floor. As you breathe out, your pelvic floor like contracts, and so your diaphragm relaxes upwards. So if we're taking a small breath or a mid-sized breath, then your pelvic floor will be in an optimum position to maintain continence or make sure that we're not getting that bearing down sensation. Next is coordination, making sure this isn't I don't think that we can really cue coordination. This is something that is really debated over in the pelvic floor literature at the moment, because a lot of people will say, okay, recruit the pelvic floor. So you brace, you recruit the pelvic floor, so you feel like you've contracted your pelvic floor, and then you go and squat. But that almost makes as much sense as, let's start flexing your quads before we do a squat. Like, there's literally no point in it, because if we take our pelvic floor to end range before we squat, it's then got nowhere to go when we need it to contract, which is on just out of the hole to maintain continence. So it's something that we need to get all of their other muscles stronger so that the pelvic floor can sort of coordinate itself and maintain that sort of pressure that we need it to. And then again, pelvic floor recruitment, I know you guys wouldn't, but don't tell your lifters to start recruiting the pelvic floor before they brace, because it almost has no effect. And then last thing to consider when bracing is equipment. A lot, unfortunately, of pelvic floor physios I've heard say to lifters, okay, let's just ditch the belt, let's not use it. It creates too much pressure, you're not using it properly. I think we should be navigating other ways of looking at it first. So making sure that their belt isn't too tight. So you can see in the one below, that is too tight. We want to make sure that there's about 2 finger spaces in between your belt and the person to make sure that we're expanding into it and it's not the belt that's trying to do the bracing for us. Because again, if you think of your core like a balloon and then you put a belt around it, you then take in a massive breath. That pressure's then only got 2 ways to go. If it's not going to go out, and it's going to go up, and it's going to go down, and it's just going to put a lot more pressure on your pelvic floor than what is necessary. So that is all that I think we need to be considering with bracing. The next thing that I'd say as coaches we can be doing is screening our athletes, and this is something that I would love to do with the team. Is screening the athletes, not just for pelvic floor dysfunction, but for like injury prevention in general. So many other sports teams do it. You know, make sure they have like before every competition season, which obviously powerlifting doesn't have. But they go through loads of injury prevention stuff, and this is just something that can be added. So pelvic health screening. What's really interesting about this screening is that it goes through all of the like the 5 main ones which I went through earlier. So are you experiencing leakage? Do you feel prolapse symptoms? Are you having any pain or discomfort? And that's all of the general stuff, which I think if any of you guys found in a lifter, you would ask them to go to a pelvic floor physiotherapist anyway. But then what I found interesting is that it's got a second section where if the lifter scores 14, which is half of all of these items within the clinical characteristics or the sport-related characteristics, then they should also be referred to a pelvic floor physiotherapist. And some of these ones are crazy because no, they're not crazy, they're very relevant. But you've got things like have been training in the sport for 9 years or more, were training of any training age before they were 14, training more than 2 hours a day, training more than 8 times a week, more than 8 hours a week, and training frequency more than 4 times a week. So straight away there, I've ticked off 5. Obviously, I don't add up to 14, but there are plenty of other things that, and powerlifting is one of those things. Plenty of these characteristics that put someone at higher risk for pelvic floor dysfunction, and should go and see a pelvic floor physiotherapist that we don't even consider. I've just put some red circles around some ones that I'll talk about in just a second. But things like if someone's just constipated, they've got an irregular menstrual cycle, and then relative energy deficiency all put you at higher risk of having pelvic floor dysfunction. So I think the next thing I talk about relates to relative energy deficiency. So that's nutrition. I'm not sure how much you guys know about relative energy deficiency in sport. I think it's becoming spoken about more and more. But it's where an athlete isn't consuming enough calories or enough energy for what their body's putting out. So it's specifically related to people who do sport and are exercising a lot. And it is related to things like an irregular menstrual cycle. You've got things that bowel being constipation, being really irritable, being depressed, can all be related to not taking in much energy. And this puts you at more risk of pelvic floor dysfunction. The reason being is because the pelvic floor is just like any other muscle. If it is not being fueled, your pelvic floor gets fatigued easier, the muscle bulk decreases, so you don't have that strength to maintain the contraction of your pelvic floor muscles to maintain continence or to maintain your pelvic organs up inside of your abdomen, of your pelvic cavity, so they can descend easier. But this becomes really difficult to talk about, or really difficult to navigate in powerlifting when we've got things like weight classes involved, where lifters are trying to cut weight all the time, or they are conscious about what weight class they're going into, so they might be under fueling their body and therefore having more pelvic health symptoms. And this is just something as powerlifting coaches that we, I think, need to be aware of, because if this is something that, let's say your lifters said, okay, I want to maintain in this class for a year to get to nationals, but they're having pelvic floor symptoms, this is something that we need to be talking about, because that increasing their calories and going up a weight class might prevent them from having the pelvic floor dysfunction in the first place. Other things within nutrition is high protein and little fiber. If their nutrition is like this, then that can lead to constipation, and constipation because there's more stuff within your abdominal cavity. You've then got more pressure, which then leads to more pressure on your pelvic floor. And then caffeine intake. Again, this one's an interesting one because the literature's a bit all over the place. People don't know if it's the caffeine that is making people's bladder more irritable, so they're feeling the need to go to the toilet more, which then leads to the pelvic floor dysfunction, or if it's the amount that they consume of caffeine, so the actual volume. So people, especially powerlifters, will typically take in 500 ml of a monster and then go and lift straight away, which can increase incontinence risk just because you've got a full bladder when you're lifting. So I think that's it for nutrition. The next thing is the menstrual cycle. So again, this links in with nutrition, but if someone's lost their menstrual cycle because they're under fueling, this can affect their pelvic health. So we want to be making sure that our lifters, if they're having pelvic health concerns, are tracking their menstrual cycle. Because I'm not sure if anyone saw, but I spoke to Bobby Butters earlier on about, I think it was about a month ago now, and she's done a bit of research in about what powerlifters, female powerlifters, are feeling throughout their menstrual cycle in relation to strength. But what she found in her research was actually that more lifters felt like they were being incontinent while they were at certain phases in their menstrual cycle. So it could be because of bloating, and you've got that more pressure in your core. It could be just you're feeling more uncomfortable, you've got more fatigue, so again, muscles fatigue, and you're more likely to be incontinent, or they've got reduced recovery, so if they're not sleeping as well, that also might be increasing their risk of incontinence or pelvic health concerns. So again, not something that we're all going to have a direct impact on, but if we're asking the questions, if we've got an athlete who's got these concerns, then okay, are you tracking your menstrual cycle? Let's go and see a healthcare professional. They've got as much data as they need to then make an impact on it. Powerlifting equipment. So that sort of relates to the menstrual health sort of area. If someone's having particular weeks in their cycle where they're feeling more incontinent, there are things that we can do about it outside of just the general pelvic floor muscle exercises, which is things like pelvic support leggings. So this is something that we might be able to suggest to a lifter. They're not the most flattering, but there are pelvic floor support shorts as well, and there is research to suggest that these elevate the bladder neck and can reduce incontinence. However, even though there's the evidence that suggests that they can reduce incontinence, you're not allowed to wear anything supportive anyway in competition. So it's just about navigating, okay, maybe we wear these in training, that gives you more support when you're training, but in competition, we're going to have to navigate that in another way. It's something that I'm looking at the moment in maybe sending off a couple of emails and just asking why we're not allowed to use the supportive underwear. I know there's the obvious reasons for like equipped, and we don't want it to be enhancing lifters lifts, but I really don't think that a pair of pelvic floor support shorts are going to be enhancing people's lifts that much, and it actually might just allow a couple hundred girls step on a platform and not feel uncomfortable when they're going up to their third attempt sumo deadlift, and feel like they can pull that without being incontinent in front of a whole live stream and in front of an audience. The last thing that I would really like to roll out is pelvic floor muscle exercise programming and incorporating that into any athlete's training, especially symptomatic lifters. The thing I would say is that I would really like it for all. I would really love for all athletes to know how to do a pelvic floor muscle exercise, because the research shows that 44 to 70% of females don't even know if they're recruiting their pelvic floor muscles correctly. And it's something that everyone knows how to flex their bicep. Everyone's got that muscle control of, okay, let me clench my butt cheeks right now, but no one knows, okay, can I feel my pelvic floor contracting? And no one really considers it. So I would like all athletes to be able to do that. But if an athlete's symptomatic, especially, doing pelvic floor muscle exercises is a must, and it's what the research most strongly supports, helps with incontinence or helps with any pelvic floor dysfunction. I've got on the screen here, it's a very DBD looking thing, I'm very aware of that, but just the sort of thing that I would love to implement would be things like treating the pelvic floor as we would in any other muscle. So if someone's being incontinent on certain times of the week, let's warm it up. Let's warm up a pelvic floor. Do 10 reps of pelvic floor exercises before you start squatting. See how that works. Let's start increasing our pelvic floor stretches. So that's just normal, really, hip stretches post session to make sure that we're not getting increased tension in our pelvic floor, which can lead to incontinence later or pelvic floor dysfunction later on down the line. And then also adding in things like more glute focus exercises, because there is research, and core focus exercises, because there is research to suggest that those two muscle groups are closely related to the pelvic floor, and if we can strengthen them, then we're less likely to rely on our pelvic floor to make up the work of what our glutes and what our core aren't doing. And the last thing that I think you guys could definitely consider, if there was an athlete that, let's say, you were referred to me or to a different pelvic floor physiotherapist, and I thought that their pelvic floor was strong enough, but they had other things that they could focus on, particularly around their glutes. There is a lot of research now coming out to suggest that glute weakness is a big has a big part to play in pelvic floor dysfunction, specifically with coordination of the pelvic floor. So if I were to come to you and say, okay, can we add in some glute drive to this client's program, then hopefully you guys will be like, yeah, of course we can. But it's just something to consider. That would be the reasoning as to why I was adding in glute exercises, rather than just being like, I think I need more glute exercises because it might help. Lastly, sorry, that's a photo of me. I think it's really important, even if one of your guys has got pelvic floor dysfunction, that we're not urging them away to stop lifting heavy. I don't think that's really I don't know how to explain. I don't think it's helpful for anyone to be like, okay, you've got something wrong, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to remove everything that you enjoy away from them. I think there's so many other ways besides just embracing it that we can get around pelvic floor dysfunction, especially sending them to a professional to get them checked out, making sure that we've given them everything that we can before we start saying, okay, let's decrease the weight. Because as you say, we might just be able to change their brace and they feel better in themselves, and they're being less incontinent on a less frequent basis. And then lastly, I do believe that we should be incorporating pelvic health into all of our athletes programming, whether that be just asking some questions every 6 months to check that they're still okay, to if someone is symptomatic, making sure that they are seeing the right healthcare professional and making sure that we're checking up on them. So that's it. I'm not sure how long that actually went on for. Let me see if I can move my screen. Any questions?
Before we jump straight into questions, first of all, I want to say thank you, because that's like genuinely is phenomenal. And I think people seeing the statistics of this, the 59% of obviously the tested audience, will get an idea of like how drastic that actually is and how many people it's genuinely impacting. There are a couple of bits that I know obviously there's a huge amount you're covering that you weren't really able to get into. So for instance, the social media narrative is a bit I do want to talk about more. But one of the things I know you and I have spoken about is, for me, a lot of people will listen to this and go, oh, there'll be symptoms, but I don't even care about it because of that narrative. Now, I don't want to fearmonger, but you and I have spoken about the long-term effects of these things. Do you mind just speaking to that a bit?
Yeah. So if someone is incontinent over a really long period of time, or they've got prolapse symptoms, so again, that heaviness feeling, there's research now to suggest that, especially for females, if you've got pelvic floor dysfunction before you've given birth, you are, oh God, I wish I could remember the statistic, but you are something like, I want to say 80% more likely to have pelvic floor dysfunction post giving birth. So, and that is the last time once you've given birth and you've had a baby that you want to be thinking about your pelvic floor, and you want to be thinking about, okay, how am I doing these how am I doing these pelvic floor muscle exercises? So that's one really important thing. That's a long-term effect. The second thing is that if you are constantly straining your pelvic floor over a long period of time, and you've got prolapse symptoms, so you've got your bladder wall is descending or your rectal wall is descending, it lower into your pelvis, that is where a lot of your nerves are. So if that bladder wall comes down and you are irritating those nerves on a constant basis, you can end up with chronic pelvic pain, and you can also end up with things like what we call urinary retention, or you're not able to feel when you need to go to the toilet, and you have to constantly remind yourself, okay, now you need to be going to the toilet, and like having a routine to go to the toilet, which is something that no one wants. So yeah, they're the two main long-term things that I think we need to be considering. So if we do have these athletes that are coming to us with these symptoms, like, we do need to be targeting them, because it's not something that is just going to go away by itself.
I will ask many questions. If someone wants to jump in before me, just go.
And can you just give me a second so I can call someone in, just so I can see you guys again?
Yeah, of course.
Or does anyone want to explain to me how I can see you guys?
The button that just says stop sharing. In fact, why don't you just continue the next question and I'll come fix it in between.
Okay, good idea.
Go ahead if you've got anything.
I had a message from, well, I actually had a couple of messages from people today, but I know that you touched on pre-childbirth pelvic floor dysfunction. Is there anything post-childbirth that athletes could be doing differently? Like, does the programming or the exercises differ pre and post-childbirth?
It's a difficult one, because it depends it depends question. It really does depend on what the athlete was doing before they got pregnant. So I'm not sure, I think her name's Lucy on Instagram, but she gets straight back into powerlifting. She literally has a baby, and then it seems like she has a powerlifting competition like within 3 months. But some people will come to you guys and they'll be wanting to start powerlifting just after giving birth. And I think the main thing to consider is if they're comfortable throughout the whole process. So it will be basically purely up to them. It's just making sure that it's a gradual progression. The thing that's coming out more now is that, providing they've been signed off by a healthcare provider and providing that they've got no other health conditions, exercise is brilliant for pre, during and post pregnancy. So I wouldn't say that there's any reason why anyone should either not start powerlifting during pregnancy with a lot of modifications towards the end of that third, or during their third trimester, and then coming back after giving birth, also it's modifications and gradually what's the right word, progressing those exercises. I think any postnatal female, if she feels ready to and she's been signed off, is perfectly safe to do squat, bench and deadlift. It's just at what weight, what frequency and what volume, and that is something that you can work with a pelvic health physio on, you can work with a general physio on, providing they've got some knowledge. But also I do genuinely think that you guys, I'm not saying all powerlifting coaches, but I do think you guys have got perfectly enough experience to be programming in a gradual and progressive way, and to be able to communicate with your athletes like you guys do on such a regular basis, to make sure that they're comfortable with every progression that you make, and just making sure that they never feel uncomfortable. Yeah, Lucy.
So I know of quite a few mums that have had babies, obviously been pregnant. One story of which has basically scarred me for life. There was a mum that used to come to my gym, and on the way to the gym once, she sneezed in her car, which caused her to be incontinent. She was pregnant at the time, and she was training throughout. My question to you is it like more normal? Is it more susceptible during pregnancy? Obviously, during different stages, you do have, a bigger belly, more pressure in your stomach. Is it more kind of acceptable at that time to have incontinence during pregnancy, whether that's from a sneeze or during training, or is that also something that you can almost try to prevent by doing exercises, training that muscle up to almost negate the risk?
Yeah. So again, unfortunately, everyone's going to be so different in that aspect. So there's going to be factors that depend on that situation. So biggest thing is, how strong were you before you were pregnant? Because if you are strong in your whole body, your pelvic floor has got less that it needs to be relied on. So if you've got stronger core, stronger glutes, that support system is going to be stronger, so your pelvic floor doesn't have to take over as much during pregnancy, where there is more pressure there. So if you're stronger beforehand, that you're less likely then to be incontinent when you become pregnant. But also it depends, because hormones do have a massive effect during pregnancy, and they do increase tissue laxity, and when you're pregnant you are more fatigued, so you're going to have good days, you're going to have bad days, and it's just something that is going to vary from woman to woman. The thing that people, or the NHS especially, are now trying to disseminate is that within your scans, within your scan appointments, females will be given pelvic floor exercises to do at each appointment. So making sure that they're doing the pelvic floor exercises throughout their pregnancy, to prevent any pelvic floor dysfunction during pregnancy, but also to help with the birth itself. So if you are doing a pelvic floor, you've got a strong pelvic floor, there's evidence to suggest that the birth becomes easier, and that you are going to be less likely to tear and things like that.
So I realised I muted myself much earlier than I intended to, but I wanted to just talk about the narrative element. So obviously this is I would consider this one of the hardest topics to approach in powerlifting at the moment, because obviously either it comes from the narrative of it's normal, normalize it, don't touch the subjects, because obviously there are scum on the internet who comment so negatively. But how you initially approach this subject of, it was mentioned in the coaches chat, because two of the coaches who can't be on video at the moment are asking questions as well. But for male coaches and female coaches, of how to initially start this conversation, I was actually going to ask, rather than just the narrative of it, markers that are not as far afield as actually experiencing incontinence. Because I was thinking, if someone just starts powerlifting, they probably haven't experienced it, but they probably do have a weak pelvic floor. So what would be your initial markers that you could just use and to discuss the pelvic floor, as opposed to waiting to a point of incontinence? And then we can talk about how you actually navigate that subject.
Okay, so are we saying I've got a lifter and we want to discuss the pelvic floor without coming across
you've got a brand new person who's just started powerlifting, you want to approach the topic to make sure they've got a strong pelvic floor, and then how you start that conversation?
So if I'm completely honest with you, it's going to be, in my opinion, and all I can think about right now is going to be the screening and making sure they know why we're asking those questions. So I think it's completely understandable that males feel uncomfortable, especially talking to females about that topic, because there are, like, I'm not going to say every female is going to want to talk to their male coach about their pelvic floor. But if we're able to explain the reasoning as to why we're asking those questions and how important it is, it can make a female feel a lot more comfortable in talking about that area and their concerns with that area. So I'm going to be completely honest, I'm not sure if you were to have a new powerlifter, I would straight away, within, like, let's say first block, be asking them about their pelvic floor and what's happening, because I don't think that is what the main goal would be. But if we could get it in within a screening form in your initial onboarding, or like part of it, have you ever had any of these concerns before? Have you been pregnant before? How did you recover from your pregnancy? Any of those sorts of questions that would seem less taboo to talk about, and then you can flag different parts of that conversation up. They then understand why you're asking those questions, and you can delve deeper into the subject.
One of the elements there that I think is really important is we both know we're not just talking about women, and so obviously a couple of those early markers are really easy to approach, where you say, like, in a screening process. But I think men specifically within this narrative as well will not discuss having had those symptoms. And I was kind of thinking, is there a way to kind of to pursue correlation over causation, right? So for instance, at the beginning of training, you utilize movements to test glute strength. That study that you had in 2024 that was looking at glute weaknesses as kind of a marker. So whether or not, if you, let's just say, not every coaching brand, and I'm sure off the back of this, we are going to discuss having some sort of screening process. But
Yes.
Let's assume everyone doesn't. If we were to start utilizing at the first stage of programming something to do with glute movements, and we can use that as a marker as to whether or not we may potentially have a concern there, because if there is a correlation, at least we can get an early, well, someone else can get an early marker as whether or not there's a problem.
It's a really difficult one, because I'm unfortunately going to have to come back on that and say that, so that research, although I've used it in that what else we call it in the presentation, because it can be applied, that research was done on runners, so it was done on glute strength in runners. So I'm not sure how applicable that actually is to powerlifters, and I'm not sure if it's like, you don't have this much weight on a glute drive, this is a marker of a weak pelvic floor. I don't think that we can really correlate pelvic floor strength to glute weakness or to core weakness in that way. The only thing that you would be able to do would be I would say the least invasive would be an external pelvic floor assessment. So that's literally just you would put your hand on someone's coccyx, so it's just like at the lower part of their back, and you can feel whether or not their coccyx tucks in and under, and see if they can do a pelvic floor muscle contraction. Other than that, it's an internal assessment, which is to specifically identify pelvic floor muscle strength is the only way that someone else would be able to do it. There's also devices that you could put inside for a female to decide whether or not their pelvic floor muscle strength is good. So that could be something that if you wanted to test out, like for them at home, if they wanted to see. But I don't think that there's anything like a specific exercise that they could do where we would be like, okay, you need to go and see a pelvic floor physiotherapist. I don't think that that's moral to say type thing.
I'll let someone else ask the next question, but one thing I think will be interesting, especially when we continue this screening, is the athletes that we send to you that screen and you come back saying there's a weakness there, if we can find correlations over time of being like, I expected that due to XYZ, I think we'll be able to find some actual information that's valuable there.
100%, yeah. And that's something we can definitely do, is look at the data that is coming in and like develop those sorts of things that like no one else has done yet, which would be incredible.
I was going to talk earlier. I think there's a massive opportunity for us to like step up our game with this, and say just the general like health questionnaire. So your initial sign up, have the health questionnaire. You can see if there are any signs being flagged, but also I think there's also opportunity to have a athlete fill out a questionnaire like every 6 months. That way we can review if there's any change, because I know we do initial health questionnaires as part of business, but as a lifter develops, there will be changes, and I think we can be more on top of that just by having a 6-monthly checkup with athletes.
So this is something that, although does need to be checked over, so I've developed a screening form that we could give to our athletes if that is something that you guys would want, and if all of the questions were useful to us. So there are some questions that obviously you've got that, like, I don't know, the bias of if you've got too many questions, they won't actually answer it properly. So it's deciding what questions are the right ones to ask, and the ones that people actually want to have help with. But once that's done, I think that's a fantastic idea of every other type of sport has an elite level, which is what DBD wants to be and is. We've got elite level lifters. Loads of other sports have these 6-monthly or screening forms that a physio or coaches will go through with the athlete, with them or not, and they come back to them with advice or with changes that they could make to their program based on what is found there, or just general things. I mean, I spoke to Callum a little while back about things like mental health, things that we wouldn't even necessarily, or any other powerlifting team wouldn't necessarily consider, but someone's mental health when they're walking into a training session each day, if their mental health is not at an optimum level, they're not going to be making the right RPE choices on a day-to-day basis, because that's not what they're thinking about. So if this is something that we can get on top of, and be like, okay, this has been flagged, they've scored 5 out of whatever it is, we think you should go and see a mental health specialist or a sports psychologist. It's just a way that we can level up our coaching and make sure our athletes are as best looked after as possible. It's just a difficult one to implement, I think, because obviously you're asking athletes about their mental health, and I wouldn't feel comfortable being like, okay, this is what you need to do about it. I don't think that's within my scope of practice.
If no one's going to jump in just very quickly, I'm aware that we don't have a whole ton of time, and so there's one big bit I want to speak on. But also, if you don't want to cover this subject, you can absolutely not a conversation want to get involved in. But the narrative, so the social media bit, like being involved in that conversation is Clem, have I taken your question? How are you going to pose it? I don't want to steal the entirety.
I was going to start similar like that. So as powerlifting coaches, how do we flip the narrative to it being normal to no, it's not normal, it's something we should actually address as coaches and athletes?
Yeah, it's a tough one, because it's like the last thing we want to do is be like, you're not normal, like this is really, really bad thing, and then literally scaremonger all of these athletes into thinking that it's the worst thing on earth, and why would you even enter a gym if you're being incontinent? Like that's not what the message that we want to send out at all. I honestly, and I mean, I'm trying to do more pelvic health content and stuff like that, is fighting back on that narrative of being like, these are the statistics of the amount of females who have incontinence. It is prevalent. You're not common. Like there are lots of females and males who are experiencing exactly the same thing as you, but there are so many things that you can do about it before you think that you can't seek help. And just showing them, like, there's so many things today that I couldn't even cover like minutes on, that are potential avenues for someone to go down. The idea that we just need to embrace it, and the idea that there's nothing that we can do about it, is simply not true. It's just, honestly, it's just what that specific athlete needs won't be the same for all athletes. Some will need strengthening, some will need like relaxing work. It's a difficult one to change the narrative of, I think, besides telling people pelvic floor physiotherapists are out there. You can do stuff about your pelvic floor without thinking that it's just part and parcel of your sport.
I think
I was just going to
a good way to flip the narrative is obviously raising the statistics, as that's evidential. but then obviously follow up with the benefits. But then after that, after you start to gain traction with the trust of the listeners, because if you're too persuasive, then it can sort of backfire. I think it's just a case of once you've providing this statistics, the benefits of it, and then people start coming with you, you start to then build a backlog of evidence of saying, like, this is actually improving lifters' experience, this is adding to their total, this is adding to their confidence. And then it kind of raises that platform and everyone then swings that direction.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to not be too persuasive, because that can sort of put people back, but then just like ease your way in, I think.
I was just going to say, I think from my experience within the sport, the kind of narrative around it has always been, you know, it's a normal thing, like it does happen because you've got people that are at an incredibly high level. I'm not going to like name names, but like a current world champion does it. And if she does it and she's still that strong, you know, is it even a problem if it doesn't affect her strength? And I think because people are unaware of the severity of it, if it's something that you continuously train with, that's kind of where those kind of narrative has really sat with. But correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm right in thinking that there are exercises you can do just by sitting on the sofa, just by sitting at your desk at work. Like, these are not challenging exercises that take that take weights or, you know, a certain piece of equipment. You know, it's something that people are just unaware of. I've been introduced to it just through having friends that have been pregnant, that have just purely, you know, wanting to not be incontinent when they sneeze. So I think what we're doing, like by just talking about it, is absolutely the right way to move forward. Are you able to kind of briefly discuss some of the exercises that people will be asked to do potentially?
Yeah, so it's a really difficult one, because the thing with pelvic floor muscle exercises is that you can't see it happening, and that is why people generally either forget or they just don't do them because they find it really boring. Like, you're not seeing your pelvic floor muscle pump. Like, do you know what I mean? It's not something that anyone is concerned about, so it's difficult to remind yourself to do, which is why I like to think of it as why it'd be really beneficial to start attaching it to training. Because even though, yes, you would just have to take yourself off to the stretching area and lie down for a bit, and or stand up, do a deep squat, like, they're all really simple things that after your training, like, we've already spent 2 hours in the gym. 5 minutes is not the end of the world at the end of your training session unless you're really stuck for time. It's something that you could do just so that people are reminded and it's on their program to tick off. But other than that, other pelvic floor muscle exercises that typically, let's say, the NHS would give out would be fast contractions. So you've got you might see it on Instagram, where you go on, off, which is basically where you squeeze your pelvic floor, you relax it, squeeze your pelvic floor, relax it quite quickly. And then again, like any other muscle group, then there's the endurance ones where you squeeze your pelvic floor, you hold it for 5, 10, 15 seconds, and then you relax it. It's very difficult to prescribe any of those exercises to anyone who's not the individual themselves, because some people don't even need to strengthen their pelvic floor, and for a lot of powerlifters, they'll need to relax it. And this is something that, again, I've barely touched on today, but I won't go into it. But if you've got really tense pelvic floor, it can create tension, which then can lead to incontinence because it's weak and tight. So yeah.
Because I'm aware of the amount of time that we've been on, first of all, to anyone who has watched this far, I applaud you for being part of a conversation that has been difficult to approach for many people for a long time. An hour of pelvic floor, though it's very important, if we've got you to this long, then fantastic. The second thing is, I want to say thank you to Emilia. This is a subject that we would not have reached on our own. And the time put into doing the presentation and doing something on this scale and actually having a positive influence is absolutely phenomenal. I've tried not to swear to make sure that this actually gets seen by a wide audience. I'm really proud. Also, the important thing is, obviously, there is not much information online, and two elements of that. One is, if you're happy, we'd like to put more of your media both on the DVD page as well as on the DVD YouTube, so they can be seen by a wider audience, which I think everyone's happy to put our name behind a bit. The second thing is, where can people find you on social media? Because I know you're putting content out.
So my Instagram handle is evm.physiotherapy.
Fantastic.
That's it.
And with that, like, if people have watched this point, we'll be working closely with Emilia. So both our athletes will be expecting to see more of this conversation, and it's not something to shy away from, and it is so unbelievably important. And so maybe this creates some degree of a change. Emilia, is there any final things you wanted to say?
I don't think so. I think I've covered an awful lot there. Don't be scared about the topic is all I'm going to say. I've touched on so many different things and it's quite overwhelming to hear it all for the first time. But once you get something that's quite individual to you, it's quite easy to navigate. I think someone needs to be there to support you through that process.
Thank you.